Hi, and welcome back again to the Britt Mayer Show. Today, I am joined with my friend, Tanner DiBella. He is an author, pastor, and the founder of the American Council. It's a prominent family advocacy group that's based in California with a heart for ministry and a commitment for promoting Christian values in the public sphere. He has dedicated his life to serving the church and the community. Through his writing, he addresses the intersection of faith, culture, and policy, aiming to inspire believers to live out their faith boldly in all areas of life. Under his leadership, the American Council has grown into a vital platform for advancing faith-based initiatives, advocating for religious freedom, and providing resources for Christians throughout crazy California. TAC, the American Council, also works to ensure that the cornerstones of our republic stays firmly rooted in faith and family. Tanner, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you.
It's great to finally meet you.
I know we were saying in the green room before that I feel like we're friends, but this is our first official time ever face to face. That's the way it works. Well, let's just dive into this. One of the things that really intrigued me about you and the work that you do is that you see politics as a vehicle for good. And I wanted to ask you how, as Christians in this time, can we use politics as a vehicle for good without compromising our beliefs and our values?
Yeah, well, that's a question that happens a lot in my local church. And, pre-COVID pandemic, my church was not a church that talked about politics. It was kind of one of those taboo things. We don't talk about it. And we kind of became awakened to this reality that was taking place in our community. And I started doing this deep research on, okay, what does Scripture actually talk about in relation to politics? And you would be surprised how much Jesus and God say about this thing called civil government. And I was drawn to this passage in Jeremiah. It's Jeremiah 29. We all know Jeremiah 29, 11. But before that, it's the story of the Israelites. They are exiled into the nation of Babylon. Babylon hates them. They're sacrificing children. They're worshiping false gods. They're engaging in perverted sexual acts. Sounds like a lot like the culture we live in today. Yep. We are in cultural Babylon. And they go to the prophet Jeremiah and they ask the prophet, what do we do? And I think they're thinking that, chariots are going to come down and deliver them from this place. But God says something so profound in that moment that I think is a beacon for us, this kind of call to action. He tells them, I want you to build homes and plant gardens. I want you to get married and have children. I want your children to have children. And he gives an instruction. I want you to increase there. Do not decrease. And as he continues to give instruction at the very end of this passage, he says, I want you to seek the welfare of the nation that I've exiled you to, because in its welfare, you will find yours. And as I was studying that, this issue, it's not like a social welfare. It's this idea of the peace, prosperity, and salvation of a nation. And so as we find ourselves in biblical Babylon, cultural Babylon, I think we've been asking that question, like, what are we to do? And I think God is giving us that same instruction of, I want you to increase. I want you to seek the peace, the prosperity, and the deliverance of your community, of your state, of your nation, because in its welfare, you'll find your welfare. And so politics is a way that me as a pastor, as a Christian, as a disciple of Jesus, I can fulfill that mandate to seek the welfare of Sacramento, seek the welfare of California, seek the welfare of the United States. And politics is a vehicle to do that.
That's so good. I love that you brought that up in Jeremiah, because I bring that up a lot too, that in exile, it wasn't like God said, okay, just go rebel, go ransack your enemies. He's like, no, I want you to, like you said, plant gardens and marry your children while you're in exile, and then seek the welfare of these enemies who have captured you. And yes, it rings so true to where we're at today. How do we do that, though, without compromising our values? I think that that's like a point of contention for a lot of Christians who tend to just do this when it comes to politics or culture wars. And they just say, it's just so complicated and there's no one good in the race, whether it's this specific race that we're now at the time of this recording, like a week out from, or just in general terms of politics. How do we engage? How do we seek the welfare in a way that we're not purists, but we're also not compromising. I don't know. I feel like that can be a really hard sticking point for a lot of Christians.
Yeah, and I mean, I think if we're all honest, I think we're all constantly trying to find where that balance is.
Mhm.
You know, I teach this class at in Sacramento, and I made the statement consistently through this election season that if we're doing this just to make sure that a man gets to the White House, or we're doing this just to ensure that the Republican Party gets power, we have lost our souls in the
Mm.
process. Like what you said at the beginning, politics is not the destination. It's not the outcome. It's a vehicle to get to something greater.
Mhm.
And so as we're evaluating, okay, how do we vote for propositions? How do we vote for candidates? How do we engage in school boards and city councils and county board of supervisors? How can we do this in a way that's one, effective, but two, redeeming?
Mm.
That balance, I think, is so hard. And ultimately, I look at like Proverbs 18:21. Solomon is talking about the power of our words and says, your tongue has the power to give life or to take it. And so as we are engaging in this culture war, I think the thing that we have to keep mindful is ultimately we want people, me as a pastor, I want people to come into the truth of who God is and what his design is for the family, for the church,
Mhm.
for government. And ultimately, I want that to be a redeeming conversation. I want to be redemptive in that. And we've kind of lost that in a lot of ways. And so for me, I look at, okay, how can I do this in such a way where I'm speaking life over people that maybe I disagree with,
Mhm.
but how can I continue to speak life over them and still speak truth? The Apostle Paul says the church is the pillar of truth. So we know that you and I have a responsibility. We are stewards, gatekeepers of the truth. And when civil government or elected officials or candidates or school board trustees or whatever the example is, when they are encroaching or perverting or defiling the truth, you and I have a responsibility to step and say, whoa, 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 no, this is truth. This is truth. However, I'm not going to degrade that person. I'm not going to dehumanize that person. I'm not going to de-dignify that person. I'm still going to show them the redemptive, loving countenance of Christ, but I don't have to sacrifice truth to do that. And so I think we have to position ourselves in such a way where we're speaking truth and redeeming and loving and standing up and speaking out. Like all these things have to work together. They're not mutually exclusive. And I think some of us have operated in that place where if we speak truth, it has to be hateful. Well, no, it might be offensive. It's going to offend a lot of
Mhm.
people, but we can speak truth in a way that still brings people to this redeeming place of who God is and how God's using us in this fight.
It's really good. Why don't we talk? That kind of brings us into one of the propositions in California. So this will be specifically for California listeners, but I think that there might be similar propositions in other states. Proposition 3 right now in California is seeking to codify same-sex marriage into the California Constitution. And you and I both opposed Proposition 3. You laid it out in a really helpful post on why, and I actually shared it with my community because I just thought it was so helpful in addressing the reasons why to oppose this proposition. But like you said, it was from a way that was intelligent. It was not hyper aggressive. It wasn't hate filled, but it's still holding the line of truth. So could you use that as an example of how we can interact and engage in politics, in culture, in a way that drives good and restrains evil without making this about a person or making it about people and dehumanizing them?
Yeah, well, Proposition 3, I mean, when you look at your ballot, it's so hard. I can empathize with people as they're looking at their ballot. Like in California, we've got uh, I think 14 propositions, and looking at those, what it says and what it does are two different things.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you look at Proposition 3 on the surface, it looks like this uh, piece that would ultimately amend the Constitution to protect the rights for same-sex couples to marry. And I'm listed as an official opponent, and the conversations I'm having with Christians are quite astonishing. I picked up the name Reverend Bigot
Mm-hmm.
because of my stance on Prop 3. And it's ultimately because people don't understand what it does. So on the surface, it looks like we're just affording same-sex couples the right to marry, but in reality, it's something completely different. at a federal level, that's already protected. And so from that perspective, it doesn't do anything. There's no more rights that are being afforded to gay couples through Proposition 3. However, in public policy, language matters, or the lack thereof. And when you have ambiguous or vague propositions like Prop 3, it is very concerning. The whole proposition is a 1.5 sentence amendment that basically says everybody has a fundamental right to marry. Here's the problem with that. They don't define who has that fundamental right and how that fundamental right is exercised or restrained. And so in California, California is one of 4 5 states that allow underage marriages. That's not like some right-wing conspiracy fringe, thought. That's California. There's thousands of underage children that get married every year. And right now it's with the consent of a judge or a guardian. When you afford someone a fundamental right, that supersedes any type of legislative action. And so it doesn't matter if you have the assembly or the state senate that has passed things that require, parental approval or the judge's sign off. If the Constitution gives a fundamental right, it supersedes all state law. And so our concern with Prop 3 is it has nothing to do with gay marriage, but it opens up the door to, in my opinion, an abuse of children, because ultimately there's no restrictions. The Constitution does not define in that amendment who's afforded that right and how that is going to play out in legislation. And so to me, it's going to allow not just children marrying children, but you're going to have this really, in my opinion, sick, perverted outcome of it, where you have adults marrying children. Polygamy is another thing that we've looked at. Alliance Defending Freedom has looked at this and agreed with my positions that this because there's no definition, it opens up the floodgates for a perversion of marriage in California.
And I think that's just such a good example of how, like you're talking about from the beginning, is how we use politics as a vehicle for good. And we don't just succumb to what the culture says is, well, it's loving to affirm same-sex marriage, so we have to put it on and we have to have it codified and it has to go through in this way that's super ambiguous. We have an obligation and a duty to actually look at what's being passed and then to restrain evil. Which is why you and I both oppose Proposition 3. Now, that heads us into the crusade against Christendom and how, like you said, we get all the names applied to us because of these positions that we hold. One of the most popular right now is to be called a Christian fascist. You wrote a whole article on how Christian fascism is a fairly new term that's really picked up recently. And you guys ran an article in June of 2022 that explained it this way. Christo-fascists believe that they're fighting primordial battles between West and East, good and evil, right and left, Christians and infidels. Simply suggesting that there is a battle between good and evil, according to Vice, is grounds for a fascist classification, which is really convenient. It was coined in 1970 by Dorothy Soleil, a liberation theologian. What is that? She argued that Christian fascism, or Christo-fascism, has always been a real threat and danger in society. It's actually one of the greatest dangers to society. She says that we fear Christo-fascism, which we see as the political direction of all attempts to place Christ at the center of social life and history. Much of the church's teaching about Christ has turned into something that is dictatorial in its heart and is preparing society for an American fascism. So, I mean, we see this term lobbied out like candy on Halloween, where, if you stand up against transgenderism and the lie that boys can become girls, or you stand for all life having inherent dignity and value from the womb all the way to the tomb, or you stand for parental rights or freedom to make your decisions when it comes to medicine, not killing a separate human being that's inside of you, you're automatically a fascist. And we've seen this smeared now on Trump. So what is really going on? What's this whole crusade against Christians in our culture? What can you give us your insight into this?
Well, ultimately, I actually think this, people love to bark separation of church and state, separation of church and state. I have been called a Christian fascist. My favorite is Christian Taliban. Um, I mean, just really outlandish, bombastic labels. And ultimately, when you like peel back the facade of what's really behind that movement, it's a separation of specific churches and state. It's
Mm.
separation of conservative church and state. Because when you look, there are progressive churches across the United States, and I don't hear these same labels, these same dogmatic viewpoints applied to them. I'll use an example in my local community. There's a church down the street, Loomis Basin UCC, and this pastor is a progressive homosexual pastor
Mm.
and was on school campuses and admitted that he tells children, he has an after school club, and tells the kids that go to this club, hey, tell your parents that you're going to the library, but in reality, you're going to my church, and I'm going to teach you all about sexuality, how to use
Whoa.
binders, how to use hormones. And so we found this out and let the community know. And we
Hmm.
got the school boards to remove him from all school campuses in our county. It was this huge story. And yet we were still the Christian fascists. And I'm like, wait. So you have one pastor here that is proselytizing children
Hmm.
to engage in certain sexual activities and sexual identities. But us standing up for the safety of children somehow makes us the fascists.
Hmm.
We're the ones forcing our viewpoint on culture. It doesn't blend. It's opposition to each other. And so to me, this kind of crusade against Christianity, it's this crusade against certain Christians with certain political views.
Mm.
And I'm seeing more and more of that as we're engaging in these issues where people have this huge issue with the American Council engaging in schools, engaging in culture, engaging in communities, engaging in elections, because they feel like we're forcing our opinions on other people. But my response to that is, but you're not.
Right. And let
Every
me
time,
piggyback on that, because
go ahead.
I think that is like connected to this idea of what I hear a lot, and you probably do, is we're not a theocracy. This is like, are you a Christian nationalist? Like, it's all the same terms, and it's all the same pushback of, why are you trying to implement your morality and your religion into our policies? Just let it be a neutral. Is that even possible? Or are we seeing the reality that everything has a moral underbelly? Everything has an ethical, everything has a worshipful underbelly. No matter if they say it or not, even the state does it. Is that how you see it?
Yeah. I mean, someone that has no religious conviction still has a moral standard in their life. It's a secular one, it's a pagan one, but it's still a moral standard. So when a atheist is going to the ballot and voting in favor of Prop 3, they're using their moral convictions to attempt to force their worldview on the rest of California.
Mm-hmm.
So this idea that like somehow Christians are doing something that not everyone else is, to me, it's just prejudice. They just hate the fact that Christians have awakened to what's going on in society, and they're saying, whoa, you've gone too far, and now we're going to push back. It's this, no, don't force your religion on me. I'm sorry, if you know history, most good laws in the United States came from a religious conviction, but that didn't establish a religion.
Mm-hmm.
Every law that is against murder is rooted in a religious conviction that murder's wrong. No religion was established in the process. Laws against polygamy and certain sexual acts and, drinking and driving, or even movements, the civil rights movement, the women's suffrage movement, all these things came from a religious conviction. And no one had a problem with that. Why? Because it didn't establish a religion. But all of a sudden, now that they disagree with our politics, they're crying wolf, and it's rooted in this hateful vitriol against conservatives that also happen to be Christians.
So how would you encourage then those conservative Christians to not flinch when they're called all the names? You and I are so far beyond that I always say I eat them for lunch. I tell my kids that. I'm like, I eat the names for lunch. But I'm so far beyond that. And I remember a time where I was really concerned about, the name calling, and was I going to be seen as mean or hateful because I don't want to be seen that way. And now it's just like, I'm going to speak the truth. And it's always with an undertone of love. But how would you encourage Christians who are kind of maybe on the brink. They're teeter-tottering of, do I become more involved and engaged in my spheres of influence in culture? Or do I just continue to show up for church on Sunday and then call it a day? I've done the Christian thing.
Yeah, well, I would tell those people you're actually not doing the Christian thing. I mean, ultimately, my question to, people that may be apathetic is, do you know the cost of your apathy? Like, do you understand what it's going to cost? Not just you, but it's going to cost your children, your grandchildren, your friends, your neighbors, your family, your church,
Mm-hmm.
by you deciding that for the sake of unity and the sake of peace, I don't want to ruffle any feathers. And I'm brought to, in Judges 9, there's this story. Gideon has died. He was this, famous leader within God's people, and he's died. And one of his sons decides, hey, I want to take power. And there's this kind of poem that ensues where the people of God they're called trees. And so the trees go out and they're starting to look for leaders. And so they go to the olive tree and ask the olive tree, will you rule over us? And the olive tree says, no, I make olive oil. Why would I hold sway over the trees? And so then they go to the fig tree and say, fig tree, will you rule over us? And the fig tree says, no, I make jam. I'm not going to hold sway over you. They go to the vine and say, will you rule over us? And the vine says, no, I get people drunk. I make people happy. I'm not going to rule sway over the trees. And they finally go to the thorn bush and say, thorn bush, will you rule over us? And the thorn bush, I'm paraphrasing, says, yeah, but you're all going to die. That story is a story of what happens when good men and women say no. And the moral of that story is that when we say no, evil men and women, will always say yes. Every time.
That's really good.
Every time.
It's really sobering.
So when you decide to say no for the sake of your convenience, you're forcing your child to say yes in 40 years. Mm-hmm. And there's going to be a cost. And so I think we've got to get out of this. We want peace with everyone, we want unity. That's not biblical peace. That's not biblical unity. There is a division. There is a tension that takes place when you and I decide to stand up for what God's design is for all of creation. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, it's our mission. God tells the prophet Isaiah that I will make all crooked places straight. That's what this is about. All these things that we're doing, the fight that you're doing, Britt, the fight that I'm doing, all of these things that we're doing, it's all about going into those crooked, dark places and making them straight. What do I mean by that? Well, there's a lot of things out of alignment with how it should be, how God designed it. Mm-hmm. God designed the family, civil government, the church in a way that's beautiful. It's perfect. It works so well together. And society has totally perverted those three institutions. And so it's our responsibility to say, no. The road is crooked. Mm-hmm. And I'm sorry, I don't care if I offend people, if I lose relationships, if people hate me, if they want to kill me, if they want to cuss at me, they want to call me anything. My responsibility in this moment, not just as a pastor, but as a Christian, is to bring all those crooked places straight, to bring them into alignment with how God designed them. That's the fight. That's the fight that we're in.
So let me ask you something with that, with the crooked roads being straight. When we look at just specific to this election, we have two candidates. We have Kamala Harris, we have Donald Trump. Those are the options. Donald Trump comes with a whole package of people. It's really become this new movement. How do you, going back to the idea of compromising, I've personally endorsed Donald Trump. That's who I voted for. I already voted. Vote early if you haven't yet. But how do you look at two imperfect people as a Christian, as a pastor, and just for you personally? I would love to know how do you decide, because they both have flaws and failures. Neither one is perfect. Do you really view it as the lesser of two evils, or do you view it as one that's going to restrain evil more? How do you dice it out and come to a point where you're able to, with all convictions fully in place, go to the ballot and vote the way that you do?
Yeah, well, I think that's a great question. And, I'll just make a comment on the lesser of two evils. Every time we vote, no matter if it could be a pastor on that ballot, it's still voting for the lesser of two evils, because we're all broken, we're all wicked, we all have evil. And so I don't want to get to a place where we somehow overemphasize that somehow this person is more evil, and so we're voting for the lesser of two. It's always that position at the ballot.
It's good.
And I am brought back to, the Apostle Paul talks about in Romans that rulers are not a terror to good work, but to evil. So when we're looking at a ballot, when we're voting, we have two choices, Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. My question isn't what is the lesser of two evils? My question is who's going to be the bigger terror to the forces of evil? Who's going to be the one that is going to terrorize evil and not good? There's a much clearer answer to that question.
Yeah.
In 1 Peter, God calls politicians ministers of God, people that he uses to effectuate his will on the earth. And so who has a history of more effectuating good change, good, moral, righteous change in our nation? That becomes much clearer. And for too long, we have hyperfixated on personality and charisma and all of these things. None of those things matter if they're wicked and evil, and they're going to terrorize the good in this world, in our communities. So when we're going to the ballot, we all have to compromise. You could find the most righteous, perfect person on the ballot. Guess what? You are still voting for a imperfect, broken, wicked person. You are. You will never find a perfect candidate. Jesus is never on the ballot. And so we have to realize every time we cast that vote, there's compromise. And so when I go to the ballot every time, every election, I cast my vote, I make compromises, I look at what are my primary issues, what are my secondary issues, and I'm not going to compromise on my primary issues, but I'm going to on my secondary issues. And as soon as I turn that ballot in, I pray to God and say, God, if I made the wrong choice, have mercy on my soul. But I pray that what I just did co-labored with what you want to see. We know that God uses broken people, so he can use this person. Is it not God that raises kings and deposes them? And so I'm trusting that as I go to the ballot, I am operating in God's will, and I'm doing it in such a way. Yeah, there's compromise, but it is bringing America closer to how God intended it to be.
That's like the clearest answer I've heard on how we can approach this, because it is complex. I don't want to minimize the feelings of that tension that you're describing, but yes, there's never going to be a perfect candidate, and that doesn't absolve us from still engaging. And I think that that's where the missing link is sometimes, where people say, well, because there's no perfect candidate, I'm not going to touch it. But no, going back to using politics as a vehicle for good and looking for that candidate who's going to terrorize evil the best, there is a clear winner, and in my personal opinion, that's Donald Trump. I think that his policies and the people that he has surrounded himself, while not perfect, are clearly going to do the most damage to what is such a growing rise of unhinged evil in our culture. And I can't imagine like another 4 years under the sway of Kamala Harris. I am deeply concerned about what that would look like for our country and for our children's future. So I think what you said is so wise. I really appreciate that. As we wrap up, I want you to just talk to us about the power of prayer in politics. You have an amazing prayer guide that I partnered with you on, and I told you in the green room, I've had so many positive just feedback from that prayer guide. It's so helpful. And then the ultimate vision and goal of the American Council, and how people can find you and find out how to be a part of what you're doing.
Well, I believe prayer is such a important component. Again, we're instructed to pray for our leaders, and I'll just put a little asterisk on that. All our leaders, right? Not just the ones that we love, not just the ones we gave money to, not just the ones we voted for, but for all leaders. And it's my conviction that we need more prayer. America needs more prayer. We have to intercede in this moment. Ask God, what is your will for this moment, and how can we help fulfill that? And so praying for our elected officials, praying for those running for office, praying for our nation, praying for a biblical type of peace, praying for a biblical type of justice, praying for a biblical type of unity. That's important. And I think we need to continue to press into that as we enter a really important election. The American Council really came out of a place of prayer. I got my undergrad in political science, went and got my master's, and I thought I was going to be in political communications, and I became a pastor. And so I thought, I'm never going to use this. This is something that seems kind of irrelevant to the vocation that I decided to enter. And then in 2019, just seeing what was happening in our state, in California, I was like, man, there's some really apathetic people that say they love Jesus, that say they care about what happens to their neighbor, but they're not doing anything about it. And so it was out of a position of prayer that I started the American Council. We have a Christian college in Rockland, and the president of that college and myself started this organization really just to register people to vote. That's all we were going to do. We were going to
Really? I didn't know that. I didn't know that
Yeah.
was your goal.
Yeah, we were going to do booths at all the churches in Placer County. There's a lot of mega churches here, and that's all we were going to do. And so we quickly realized as people were having conversations with us at the booths, it's like, oh man, there's people that are Christians, but they're not voting like Christians. And so we're like, okay, we have to get an educational piece to this. So myself and Dr. John Jackson did a We the People class at a church in Rockland, California, and 1,000 people showed up.
Whoa.
And we did 11 weeks of teaching people this is what the Bible says about history, about politics, about ethics, about civil government, about the family, about the church. And so after that 11 weeks, we had hundreds of people coming to saying, okay, what do we do now? Like we're mobilized, we're excited, we're energized. What's the response? And so like, okay, now we need to get involved and get people, at their school boards and going to the Capitol. So we hired a lobbyist. And so all these things kept happening to where eventually we became this organization that does three things. We educate. So we do a lot of online classes, and I teach all over the United States, and all about how can we equip the Christian, the family, to engage in this moment. We do a lot of advocacy work. We've got a lobbyist at the state capitol. We're informing people on what's happening in legislation and giving them opportunities. You've partnered with us on a lot of those this last session.
Wonderful. Yeah.
And then elections is how can we get good men and women, moms and dads, pastors, aunts, uncles, neighbors, to run for local offices across the state. And so we have recruited, trained, and supported 823 candidates after this election. And so far we have an 80% success rate.
That's incredible.
Getting good men and women to say yes.
Wow.
To say yes, stand up, to be leaders in their community. That's what it's all about. And so those three things, that's what we're about. And again, it goes back to what I said earlier. It's all about making those crooked places straight. That's our mission. That's our heart, empowering the family, empowering their voice to fulfill that.
I love what you're doing. I also think that you filled such a vacancy. When I look back on what education looked like in early America, our kids had catechism. I have some of the early primers, like the Noah Webster books of ethics, and just the early catechisms for our kids that every young American student went through. And it was all Bible. Like that's what our kids were learning. And it makes me sad because it's like now they're reading porn, in schools and being taught that they're a they, them, or a furry. But when you really look at what education was back then and how rich and beautiful it was, not only in biblical history, but in world history and their own American history, and how that just led to a patriotism for this country. And that over the years has just been, it really does make me emotional because it's just been so vacuumed out, and Jesus is taken out in the 60s, prayer is taken out, the 10 Commandments are taken down, catechism, it's long, long gone in the school system. But in that, you make a people so ignorant, and that has left such a void because now people can't really find their way in the dark. And what you guys have done is you've stepped in and said, let's make education great again. Let's find a way to educate people so that they feel confident in going to the polls, in voting, in running, in standing up in their community, in showing up to a school board. And you've equipped people to be able to do that very well. So I'm so thankful for the work that you're doing. And I'm glad that you were able to come on today to just share your heart and your ministry in the American Council. Could you tell people how they can find you if they want to get involved and learn more?
Yeah, you can go to our website, theamericancouncil.com. We've got a ton of free resources, classes, ways to get involved on there. And then social media, we're always putting stuff out there for people to engage, whether it's through prayer, education, or seeing what's going on in the state. Social media is at the American Council as well. And I would encourage people, of all the different things that we do, starting with the education piece is so important. What you don't know, you don't know. And so really opening your eyes to, we all know the sad state of affairs we're in, but having a good response to it is so important. And so starting kind of with the education, some of the classes are a great launching point for people that are saying, how do I get involved?
Is that something too that you could bring your kids alongside with the education classes that you have? And then could you also offer that for a church as a whole if a church wanted to go through any of those courses?
Yeah, I was actually just in Tennessee. A church in Memphis was doing our Bible study. So all the classes that we have a class on human sexuality, a class on Israel, a class on civics, a class on ethics, and a class on the different institutions that the Lord's created. All these different classes we've done are all family friendly. So kids are able to participate in it. And then churches are able to engage in it for free to do kind of their own Bible studies and classes around some of that curriculum, which is super helpful.
One last thing, I know I keep keeping you, but the sexuality class, is that the one by Changed that you partnered with?
Yeah,
so I personally, I took that course. It's so good. I have recommended that to so many people offline, online. Awesome. Oh, it's so good. I really encourage anyone who's listening to go check that out. What's the name of it?
I love it. It's called Navigating LGBTQ is the name of the class. Yes. But when you go to the American Council and go to e-courses. But what I love about that class, Britt, is all the people that are teaching it have lived in those lifestyles before. Former people in trans identities, same-sex relationships and marriages. Like, it makes it that much more powerful to see people that have been redeemed out of that.
Yes.
And then show people this is the way out. We've navigated a path to get out of that and live in truth. And to me, it's just so compelling.
And like you said, education is key. And so for me, it gives you the tools. I actually told my mother-in-law, because she's always struggling. She's like, I just don't want to be mean. Like, go listen to this course, because it gives you the tools to where you say it in love, but from education, like an educated standpoint. So all of the stuff that you guys do, the education that you provide, is so valuable and so good. And you're amazing, Tanner. Thank you so much for coming on. We'll have you back again soon. I'm sure we'll talk about what ends up happening with this right around the corner, this election.
It'll be fun.
It'll be fun. Thank you so much. Talk to you soon.